The year was 1678, and the rugged valleys of Jalisco, Mexico, carried both beauty and hardship. This was not the Jalisco of modern roads, bustling plazas, and music. It was a land still finding its way under the heavy hand of Spanish rule. Villages were small, built from stone and clay, surrounded by vast fields and dense mountains. Life was slow, but it was never easy. The people of Jalisco lived close to the earth. Their survival depended on farming, livestock, and the seasonal rains. The sun scorched their backs by day, while at night the Sierra Madre mountains loomed like silent guardians, sometimes comforting, sometimes intimidating. For the villagers, the land was more than soil, it was life itself. If the land was kind, families ate. If the land was cruel, hunger visited every home. But in 1678, the balance between faith, fear, and survival was fragile. Religion was at the heart of every decision. In those days, the church bell was not just a sound, it was the center of life. It marked the hours of prayer, the beginning of harvest, the funerals of loved ones. People believed that everything, whether fortune or disaster, was tied to God's will. A good harvest was a blessing. A sudden illness was a test, and anything that could not be explained, well, it was either divine intervention or the devil's work. Priests were seen as the ultimate interpreters of truth. To challenge the church was unthinkable, and yet, even with their faith, fear of the unknown ran deep, for behind every prayer was also a whisper of superstition, old beliefs carried by the indigenous people, mixed with Spanish Catholic traditions. Dreams, omens, and unexplained events were never ignored. In the towns of Jalisco, there was also tension. The Spanish officials governed with authority, often favoring themselves and their kin. Indigenous people, whose ancestors had lived on the land for centuries, were treated as outsiders in their own soil. Their wisdom of the earth, how to read the stars, how to sense changes in the wind, how to interpret signs in nature, was dismissed by the ruling class as superstition. But the common villagers who lived between both worlds carried both faiths in their hearts, the Catholic prayers taught by the church and the old stories whispered by their grandparents. This blending of beliefs made Jalisco a land of both devotion and mystery. Life in 1678 was not filled with noise and distraction. There was no electricity, no printing press in every home, no books for the poor. Most villagers could not read or write. Their knowledge was passed down through storytelling around firelight, through proverbs and songs. The nights were especially powerful. Imagine a night in Jalisco, no lamps, no city glow, only the vast darkness of the mountains pierced by a sky overflowing with stars. The silence was so deep you could hear the river breathing, the coyotes calling, and your own thoughts whispering back at you. In that silence, fear grew quickly. A strange sound, a flicker of light, an unexplained illness. These were not small things in such a world. Without science, without explanation, people turned to either prayer or panic. In 1678, life expectancy was short. A fever could kill a child overnight. A failed harvest could mean starvation for a whole village. Families lived with death closer than we can imagine today. This made them more alert, more cautious, more suspicious of anything out of the ordinary. They didn't have the luxury of ignoring mysteries, because often mysteries meant danger. So when strange things began to happen in Jalisco, the flickering lights over the mountains, the bitter wells, the dying livestock, the setting was already perfect for fear. The people were prepared to believe almost anything, because in their world, nothing was impossible. The land itself seemed alive. The mountains of Jalisco weren't just mountains. They were seen as ancient beings, protectors, and sometimes punishers. Rivers weren't just rivers. They were lifelines, gifts that could be taken away. The villagers walked carefully on this earth, speaking of it with respect, almost reverence. But when that land began to act strangely, when it seemed to reject the very people who depended on it, it struck terror in their hearts. If the earth turned against them, who could they turn to? That was Jalisco in 1678. A people caught between faith and fear. A society divided between the ruling class and the indigenous wisdom. A land of silence, where the smallest mystery grew into a tale of terror. a fragile balance between survival and destruction. This was the setting, a place where every unexplained event had the power to shatter the community because the line between life and death was so thin. So when the mystery of 1678 began, the lights in the sky, the poisoned wells, the dying herds, it was not just an event. It was a storm that shook every foundation the people of Jalisco stood upon, and that is why the mystery that challenged all experts mattered so deeply. It wasn't only about the strange signs themselves. It was about what they revealed, the fears of the people, the blindness of the powerful, and the wisdom hidden in voices the world refused to hear. The year 1678 in Jalisco had already been harsh. The rains had come late, the fields looked tired, and whispers of sickness ran through the villages. People prayed more often, lighting candles at the feet of wooden saints, asking for mercy, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to unfold. It began quietly, so quietly that some villagers thought they had imagined it. One night, a farmer named Domingo returned from tending his goats in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. As he walked home beneath the open sky, he noticed something strange above the mountains, a flickering light, like a torch floating in the darkness. At first, he thought it was a traveler, but as he stood watching, the light split into 3, then into 5, dancing in the night like restless spirits. Domingo ran home trembling, telling his wife and children. By morning, the story had spread. At first, no one believed it, but the very next night, others saw it too. The mysterious lights moving across the mountains, vanishing suddenly, then reappearing higher in the sky. At first, some villagers were curious. They stood outside their homes at night, pointing, whispering, and making the sign of the cross. But curiosity soon turned to fear, because the lights were only the beginning. Within days, something more terrifying happened. Families woke up to find their livestock dead, not slaughtered, not attacked by wolves, but lying still as if life had simply slipped away. Goats, chickens, and even strong oxen collapsed without warning. For farmers who depended on their animals for survival, this was disaster. Panic grew, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said the lights in the sky were souls of the dead looking for revenge. Others claimed it was witchcraft, that someone in the village had cursed them. A few even believed it was the devil himself walking among them. As fear gripped the town, another blow came, perhaps the most frightening of all. The wells, once pure and refreshing, turned bitter. Families drew water and found it foul, smelling, tasting of rot. Some who drank it fell ill with fever. Mothers wept as their children vomited after drinking from the same wells that had sustained them for years. Without clean water, the villagers faced not only fear, but also thirst and sickness. This was no longer just a strange phenomenon. It was survival itself slipping away. As if the lights, the dead animals, and the bitter wells weren't enough, the villagers began reporting something even stranger: voices in the night. Farmers claimed they heard whispers near their barns, though no one was there. Shepherds in the mountains swore they heard songs in languages they couldn't understand. Even more unsettling, some families began having the same dreams. They described shadowy figures calling out to them, warning them that the land is crying. How could so many people share the same dream? The more the people talked, the greater their fear grew. The church was filled with desperate prayers. The candles at the altar never seemed to burn out, because as soon as one was gone, another villager lit one in trembling hope. The fear soon reached the ears of Spanish officials. Jalisco was not an isolated place. It was part of the New Spain colony, and order had to be maintained. A small group of soldiers and a government-appointed investigator were sent to the village. The investigator listened to the people, took notes, and examined the dead livestock. But he found no wounds, no signs of attack. The animals looked as though they had simply collapsed. When he tasted the well water, he spit it out immediately. It was indeed bitter, impossible to drink. The officials offered no comfort. Instead, they blamed the indigenous people, accusing them of secretly practicing forbidden rituals. Fear turned into suspicion. Neighbors looked at each other differently, wondering who among them had called this curse upon the land. Meanwhile, the church declared that the lights and the sickness were signs of divine judgment. Priests led long processions through the village, carrying crosses and chanting prayers. They sprinkled holy water on the wells, blessed the fields, and performed exorcisms in barns. Healers from the indigenous community tried their own remedies, burning sage, mixing herbs, and chanting prayers in the old languages. But nothing seemed to stop the strange events. The more they tried, the more hopeless the people felt. Weeks passed, and the incidents only grew worse. More animals died. Crops turned yellow before harvest. Families argued and accused one another of bringing evil into the community. Fear fractured trust, and unity began to crumble. The nights grew longer, colder. Children clung to their parents, terrified of the whispers outside their homes. Men who had once walked proudly through the fields now looked over their shoulders, afraid of shadows. Women cried quietly, praying that the next morning would bring relief. The village had become a place of fear, a place where no one felt safe, where every sound was suspicious, every shadow threatening. This incident wasn't just about lights in the sky or poisoned wells. It was about the way fear can transform people, how the unknown can strip away reason, and how fragile life can be when people stop trusting one another. In 1678, the people of Jalisco stood at the edge of despair. They had done everything they knew: prayer, ritual, investigation, and still the mystery deepened. But it was in this darkest moment that the seeds of truth, humility, and wisdom would later grow. What they saw as a curse was, in reality, a call to see differently, to look beyond fear and listen to voices they had long ignored. The strange lights, the dying livestock, the bitter wells, and the whispers in the night had shaken Jalisco in 1678 to its core. Fear was no longer just a private feeling inside homes. It had become a public storm, threatening the stability of the entire community. When fear grows this powerful, authority cannot ignore it, and so the investigators were summoned. Word of the disturbances reached Guadalajara, the colonial capital not far from Jalisco. Spanish officials feared that unrest, fueled by superstition, might turn into rebellion, so they sent a small detachment of soldiers, along with a royal investigator named Don Rodrigo de Alvarado. Don Rodrigo was a proud man, trained in law and educated in Spain. To him, whispers of curses and spirits were nothing more than peasant tales. He believed in evidence, testimony, and authority. As he rode into the village with his men, the people lined the narrow streets, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Some saw him as a savior, others worried he would bring punishment instead of answers. The first to meet him were the priests of the local parish. Dressed in black robes, crosses swinging from their necks, they told Don Rodrigo that the village was under divine judgment. They insisted that sin, witchcraft, or hidden heresies had invited evil into the land. The lights in the mountains, Father Miguel declared, are the souls of the damned. God is warning us. We must purify this town. Don Rodrigo listened politely but dismissed the idea of spirits. Still, he knew better than to openly challenge the church. In 1678, even the most powerful investigator could not stand against the authority of the clergy. While the priests cried punishment, the indigenous healers and elders whispered a different story. An old man named Teodoro, respected among the native families, approached Don Rodrigo. "This land is not cursed," Teodoro said quietly. "It is crying. The animals drink poison, the wells are sick, and the mountains show their pain. If you listen, you will hear." But Don Rodrigo brushed him aside. To the Spanish investigator, an old indigenous man's words carried no weight. The crown valued authority, not humility. Yet the villagers noticed. Some felt torn. Should they trust the priests who spoke of punishment, or the elder who spoke of nature's warning? Don Rodrigo began his official work. He examined the dead livestock, looking for wounds. He found none. He tested the water in the wells, tasting the bitterness himself before spitting it out in disgust. He ordered samples taken in clay jars, though he had no tools to truly analyze them. The soldiers combed through barns, fields, and homes, searching for signs of witchcraft, strange carvings, idols, or forbidden rituals. They found nothing but rosaries, tools, and family relics. And yet, as thorough as the inspections were, the answers did not come. Each day brought more dead animals, more foul water, and more fear. The village became a stage for debate. The priests thundered from the pulpit, "Repent fast, pray until the heavens release their mercy." They saw no mystery, only a punishment for sins yet unspoken. The officials scoffed, claiming the problem was caused by ignorance, or perhaps sabotage by enemies of the crown. Don Rodrigo even suggested that the villagers themselves might be exaggerating their troubles for attention or relief from taxes. Meanwhile, the healers spoke in hushed voices, warning that the land itself was warning them of neglect. They urged the villagers to cleanse the fields, to respect the rivers, to restore balance. The people were caught in the middle. One day they knelt before the altar begging forgiveness. The next they sought herbs and smoke from the healers. And all the while the fear deepened because the experts could not agree. Weeks passed and still the mystery remained. The priests grew louder, the officials grew harsher, and the villagers grew more desperate. Don Rodrigo, who had arrived with confidence, now paced restlessly at night, unable to explain what he had seen with his own eyes. Even he had witnessed the strange lights in the mountains, dancing where no human torch could climb. The failure of authority was clear. For all their education, power, and ceremony, the experts could not bring peace to the village. Instead, their contradictions only deepened the divisions among the people. It was during this time of confusion that the old indigenous elder Teodoro quietly continued to watch and listen. While the officials argued and the priests preached, he studied the land itself. He walked the fields where the livestock had died. He tasted the water carefully, noting its strange stench. He knelt by the riverbanks, watching how the soil shifted, how the plants withered unnaturally. He saw what no one else saw, not because he was more intelligent, but because he was more humble. He was not trying to prove his authority, he was trying to hear the truth. The arrival of investigators in Jalisco showed something deeper than the mystery itself. It revealed how often in life, those with the loudest voices and the highest titles may not have the answers. Priests, officials, soldiers, all of them had power, but none of them had clarity. And yet, in the quiet corner of the village, the old elder carried the truth within him. By the time the investigators had finished their inspections and the priests had completed their rituals, the people of Jalisco hoped the nightmare would pass. They longed to believe that prayer, authority, or ritual would restore peace. But the mystery only grew stronger, slipping beyond the grasp of both science and faith. The lights in the mountains did not fade. If anything, they grew brighter and more frequent. Entire families gathered outside at dusk, watching as fiery orbs floated in silence, rising and falling as if guided by an unseen hand. Some nights, the lights appeared in groups, weaving in and out of each other like dancers. On other nights, a single burning glow hovered motionless above the valley for hours before vanishing in an instant. The priests insisted the lights were the souls of the damned. The officials dismissed them as tricks of the atmosphere. But for the villagers who lived under the naked sky with no lanterns or glass to trick the eye, the lights were undeniable and terrifying. Children clung to their mothers, crying. Men who once mocked the stories began carrying crosses around their necks. No explanation calmed the fear because the phenomenon refused to end. It was not only the skies that disturbed them. Soon, a different kind of mystery crept into their lives, one that came when they closed their eyes. Dozens of villagers began reporting the same dream. In it, they stood in the valley at night, and the ground beneath them shook as if the earth itself was weeping. A shadowy figure appeared, speaking words they could not fully understand, but always repeating the same warning: the land is crying. The first time one family spoke of this dream, others gasped in shock. They had dreamed it too. As the days went on, nearly every family in the village had a version of the same vision. What explanation could there be for an entire village sharing one dream? Priests said it was divine prophecy. Officials accused the villagers of fueling each other's imaginations. But deep in their hearts, the people felt something bigger was at work, and then came the voices. Farmers working late in their barns swore they heard whispers, as if someone stood behind them. Shepherds claimed they heard soft chanting in languages they did not know. Families huddled together at night, startled by what sounded like footsteps outside their doors, though when they opened them, no one was there. Some villagers began refusing to leave their homes after dusk. Others carried torches everywhere they went, convinced that fire would ward off whatever haunted their land. The mystery was no longer just in the skies or the wells. It had entered their very lives, invading their dreams, their homes, and their sense of safety. As the events escalated, so did the divisions among the people. The priests doubled their calls for repentance, demanding confessions from every villager. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor, each wondering who had angered heaven. Meanwhile, the Spanish officials grew impatient. Don Rodrigo scolded the people for their weakness, insisting there must be a natural cause. He even accused them of fabricating the incidents to gain attention and favor. His arrogance further deepened mistrust, and yet the indigenous elders quietly warned that no confession or accusation would solve the problem. The land is sick, Teodoro whispered to those who would listen. And when the land suffers, so do the people. But his words were drowned out by louder voices, voices of power, not wisdom. The breaking point came one morning when the villagers discovered that 3 wells had gone completely dry overnight. Families awoke to buckets scraping against stone, pulling up nothing but dust. Without water, survival itself hung in the balance. The priests led an emergency mass, filling the church with desperate prayers. Mothers held sick children in their arms, fathers begged for rain, and tears fell like rivers. Outside, soldiers patrolled, powerless to do anything but watch. The fear was now unbearable. What had started as strange lights in the sky had become a full crisis threatening life itself. By now it was undeniable, the priests, the healers, the officials. None had answers. The rituals brought no relief. The inspections yielded no solution. The villagers stood in the middle of their suffering, betrayed by the very authorities they had trusted to protect them. The experts had failed, and the people were left with only fear. And yet, as the noise of argument and fear filled the air, the old elder Teodoro continued his quiet observations. He listened to the people's dreams. He tested the water with his tongue and his nose, noting its bitterness. He watched the patterns of the livestock, the soil, and the flow of the rivers. Where others sought miracles or curses, he sought understanding. And slowly, the truth began to reveal itself to him, not in fire from heaven, not in prophecy, but in the simple, overlooked signs of the earth. By the time the wells ran dry and fear consumed the village, Jalisco in 1678 had become a place of despair. Families were hungry, livestock continued to die, and even the strongest men admitted they no longer slept at night. Fear had taken root so deeply that every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning. The priests still thundered about sin, the officials still accused the villagers of weakness and superstition, but the people were tired of words without answers. They needed truth, not more sermons, not more orders. And that is when a voice long ignored finally rose above the noise. His name was Don Teodoro, an old indigenous elder with weathered skin and eyes that had seen more seasons than most of the villagers combined. He had spoken before, quietly warning that the land was crying, but few had listened. In a world where titles carried more weight than wisdom, his words had been dismissed as superstition. But desperation changes everything. With their children thirsty, their fields failing, and their animals dying, the villagers began to turn toward the one man who had been calm from the beginning. One evening, as the church bells tolled, the villagers gathered in the plaza, waiting for another sermon or decree. Instead, Don Teodoro stepped forward, leaning on his cane. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the crowd with a quiet authority that silenced even the priests. "This land is not cursed," he said, looking at the weary faces before him. "It is neglected. The earth does not punish without reason. Listen to it. It is crying." The officials scoffed. Father Miguel frowned, but the people, desperate for any glimmer of hope, followed Teodoro as he led them out of the village and into the fields. He walked slowly, stopping at places most had overlooked. He knelt by patches of withered grass, digging into the soil with his hands. He examined the bodies of dead livestock, sniffing their mouths and the water they had drunk. Finally, he led them to a cluster of wells. The air around them carried a faint, foul stench that most villagers had grown so accustomed to they no longer noticed. Teodoro knelt beside one well, cupped the water in his palm, and held it beneath his nose. "This water is not holy or cursed," he said softly. "It is sick." Teodoro explained what no priest, soldier, or official had seen. Beneath the ground, not far from the wells, a hidden reservoir had grown rotten. Years of waste, decay, and neglect had seeped into the underground water, poisoning the very source of life. The animals that drank from it died slowly, their bodies unable to endure the poison. The crops withered because they too fed on the tainted water. And the bitterness that mothers tasted in their children's cups was not a curse, but the simple truth of contamination. As he spoke, the people listened in stunned silence. What had seemed like a supernatural terror was in fact something natural, something caused not by spirits or sin, but by neglect and ignorance. Don Rodrigo, the royal investigator, said nothing. For weeks, he had mocked the villagers and accused them of weakness, but he had no answer now. Father Miguel lowered his eyes, ashamed that he had called the suffering a punishment from God when it was the earth's warning all along. For the first time, the power of titles and robes meant nothing. A man with no office, no crown, no book, only wisdom, had revealed the truth that all the experts had missed. Once the truth was known, the people acted quickly. They stopped drinking from the poisoned wells, relying instead on cleaner springs further in the mountains. They dug new channels to bring safer water into the village. The elders taught the villagers how to watch the soil, the plants, and the rivers so that such a disaster would not happen again. The lights in the mountains, Teodoro explained, were nothing more than gases escaping from the poisoned ground. Strange to the eye, but not supernatural. The dreams, he said, were the shared cries of a people living under the same fear, their minds shaping their pain into visions. Slowly, the village began to recover. The animals stopped dying, the children grew stronger, the fear lifted, replaced by a hard but hopeful determination to care for their land with more respect. The turning point was not only the discovery of poisoned water. It was the moment the villagers realized that wisdom can live in unexpected places. For too long, they had ignored the quiet voices among them, the elders, the humble, the ones who spoke with patience rather than pride. They had placed their faith entirely in robes and uniforms, forgetting that truth is not bound to titles. The revelation forced them to confront their pride, their fears, and their blind obedience. They learned that mysteries are not always meant to frighten us. Sometimes they are meant to awaken us. In the weeks that followed, the lights faded, the wells cleared, the whispers in the night stopped. But the memory of the mystery never left. Parents told their children the story of the year the land cried, not as a tale of terror, but as a lesson in humility and vigilance. The priests preached differently, softer now, reminding the people that God gives wisdom to all, not only to the powerful. Even Don Rodrigo, humiliated but wiser, admitted in his final report that the truth had been revealed not by authority, but by a simple man of the land. And Teodoro, he returned to his quiet life, walking the fields with the same calm patience as before. He asked for no credit, no honor. His reward was seeing his people safe again. When the dust of fear finally settled and the truth about the poisoned underground reservoir came to light, the town of Jalisco found itself standing at a crossroads, not just of survival, but of understanding. What had once seemed like a supernatural curse turned out to be a reminder that human neglect often creates its own disasters. At first, the townspeople were ashamed. They had mocked Don Teodoro, the indigenous elder, for years. They had dismissed his voice as old folklore, irrelevant in a world run by Spanish officials and church authorities. Yet it was his wisdom, rooted not in books or power, but in observation and respect for the land, that saved them. The very man they ignored became their greatest teacher. This realization planted a seed of humility in their hearts. For too long, they had believed that truth only flowed from crowns or cassocks, from the rulers and the priests. But now they saw that wisdom had no uniform. It could come from the lips of a poor farmer, an old woman, or a child, and ignoring those voices had nearly destroyed them. The lesson was profound. Never underestimate the power of overlooked wisdom. Respecting the land, the poisoned water was not a random tragedy. It was a direct consequence of neglect. The townspeople realized they had used the land without truly caring for it. They took water without checking its source, grazed animals without monitoring their health, and trusted wells without maintaining them. Nature, patient as it was, finally forced them to notice. From that day on, the community adopted new practices. Wells were inspected regularly. Farmers worked together to keep the land clean and fertile. They learned to rotate grazing, protect natural water sources, and share responsibility for the resources that kept them alive. It was a hard truth, but it transformed them. If you ignore the land will eventually ignore you. Perhaps the greatest change was not just how they treated the earth, but how they treated each other. The crisis had shown them that fear makes people quick to divide. Some blamed witches, others accused neighbors of secret sins, while others clung blindly to rituals hoping for salvation. Division had almost torn them apart, but unity had saved them. When they finally chose to listen to one another, when they gave Don Teodoro a chance to speak, light entered the darkness. It was not a miracle from the sky, but the simple power of listening, of humility, of shared responsibility. The townspeople began to understand that survival depended not on pride, but on community. They began to hold gatherings not only in the church, but in the open square where anyone, rich or poor, could speak. And little by little, they built a culture where every voice mattered. The priests, too, had to confront their own limits. They had believed that holy rituals alone would solve the problem, but when prayers and exorcisms failed, they were humbled. This did not weaken their faith, it deepened it. One priest stood before the people and admitted, "Faith is not an escape from responsibility. God gave us minds to think, ears to listen, and eyes to see. We failed when we ignored these gifts." This shifted the people's understanding of spirituality. They realized that divine help often works through human responsibility. Miracles are not always flashes of light from the heavens. Sometimes they are found in the wisdom of an elder, in the discovery of polluted water, or in the courage to change old habits. The lesson became clear. Prayer without action is empty, and action without humility is blind. Years later, the story of 1678 was told to children not as a tale of fear, but as a parable of wisdom. Parents would gather their children at night and say, "Do not be too proud to listen. The land has a voice. The old carry memories. Even the silent carry truth. If we close our ears, the mystery will punish us. But if we open them, the mystery will guide us." The younger generation grew up with a sense of respect, not just for their elders, but for the earth itself. And though new challenges came with time, droughts, storms, political upheavals, the memory of 1678 remained a guidepost. Face the unknown with humility, unity, and responsibility. Looking back, what happened in Jalisco was not just about poisoned water or dying livestock. It was about the eternal struggle of humanity, to see beyond fear, to listen beyond pride, and to understand that the mysteries of life are not always meant to terrify us. Sometimes they are meant to wake us up. We too face mysteries today, a disease we cannot explain, a failure we cannot understand, a silence from God when we desperately need an answer. In those moments, fear can make us believe we are cursed, abandoned, or helpless. But the lesson of Jalisco reminds us, not every mystery is a curse. Some mysteries are teachers. When something in your life feels unexplainable, do not rush to fear. Ask instead, what is this trying to teach me? Who have I ignored that might carry the answer? What responsibility have I neglected? In 1678, Jalisco learned that survival does not come from fear, pride, or division. It comes from humility, listening, and unity. What challenged all experts was not really a curse. It was their own unwillingness to look deeper. And when they finally did, the mystery transformed them forever. So remember this, the greatest mysteries in life are not meant to destroy us. They are meant to awaken us,